SMC Radio.
What is up? You are listening to SMC Radios with E. If you're just tuning in, thanks for doing so. If you've been listening this whole time, I appreciate your continued interest. So for this part of the program, we're going to talk a little bit about the technicality of radios. What are they and how do they work? So, like I said in the beginning, radios are all about frequencies. And you have the radio spectrum, which is 88 to 108 megahertz. And when we're talking about frequency, or how that relates to radio, is frequency is the property that controls, say, the pitch of a sound wave, or the color of a light wave. And in the case of radio, it's the band and channel of the radio signal. So, FM actually stands for frequency modulation, which we'll talk about in a second. But first I want to talk about, there are two different kinds of radios. First, you have a transmitter, which is taking a signal and sending it out across space. And then you have a receiver. And a receiver is then taking that signal and putting it through a speaker so you can listen to it. So we're going to be talking about how those two different kinds of radios work, starting with the transmitter. So, in simplest terms, what the transmitter is doing is taking a message or data, in this case an audio signal, and encoding it into sine waves that can be sent out across the air on something known as carrier waves, because they're carrying information and they're being sent at a very particular frequency. And in order to make sure that they're being broadcasted or encoded to this particular frequency, they're being modulated. So, how do we create this modulation? A transmitter, in simplest terms, like I said, it's taking this encoded message, sending it through a wire, and that signal then goes through a capacitor, and then an inductor, which is a little metal coil, and then to a transistor, which is then being amplified. So the first step is we got to create that modulation, that encoding, which happens through an oscillator. And what the oscillator is doing is making sure that you are broadcasting on this particular frequency and creating rapidly changing electrical current. And then from the oscillator, your signal goes into something called a PLL, which is a phase lock loop. And the reason the PLL exists is because when your components are heating up on the circuit board, like the longer they're running, it can actually, especially that little metal coil I was talking about, the inductor and the capacitor, to heat up in a way that would actually cause the frequency to drift. And that's just completely impractical when it comes to, like I was talking about before, RF interference, but then also you don't want your listeners to have to be changing the dial in order to keep listening to you. So the oscillator runs into the PLL, which essentially makes sure that your frequency isn't drifting. And then the PLL runs back into the oscillator, and then the oscillator from there runs into gain stages, which give the signal power. So for every 3 decibels, your signal actually doubles. And then from there, it goes to amplifiers, and then it goes out of coaxial, which is attached to an antenna, which is then shoots your signal through space in a well-defined relationship between electric fields and magnetic fields. But backing up just a little bit, another important part of a transmitter is actually a filter. And that's because our signal that we're sending out usually has a lot of harmonics or overtones. So, and those overtones can cause RF interference. So usually having some sort of compressor or low pass filter on your transmitter is really important because it eliminates some of those harmonics. So, you have your signal. It's going out of your transmitter into a coaxial or a coax cable, which is characterized by its impedance, which in this case is 50 ohms, which is perfect for RFs, radio frequencies. And they're also used for cable television for that reason. Coaxial, impedance, 50 ohms. That's really all you need to know. So the coaxial is what connects the transmitter to the antenna, which the antenna is a metal conductor that is sending the signal out. And so what's important to know about radio waves is they're actually 10 feet big, which is so cool to think about, that you have like these 10-foot tall waves that you can't see or hear or feel, that are just traveling around in the air constantly all around us. But radio waves, for the most part, travel in a straight line until they hit an obstacle and need to adjust accordingly. And during that adjustment, you can actually get some signal loss. So height is really important when it comes to antennas, because you want to make sure they're high up enough that you have the least amount of obstacles in your radio frequency, or in your radio wave paths. And that's why we see antennas, for the most part, that are super, super tall, or they're on top of roofs. And then height is also really important when it comes to antennas, just in regard to the actual length of the antenna. So the length of the antenna is going to depend on the frequency at which you want to broadcast. And the reason why the length is important is because the signal that you're sending out actually travels up and down the antenna, and if the antenna isn't the correct height, it could be traveling back down the antenna into your transmitter, and if it does that enough times, you can actually end up frying your transmitter. So we use something called an SWR meter, or a standing wave ratio meter, in order to measure the length of an antenna. And what you do is you take the meter, you attach the antenna to the meter, and you put in what frequency you want to be broadcasting at, and then you adjust accordingly based on the data that the meter is giving you. So, once again, transmitters, they are encoding a message by creating rapidly changing electrical currents. You have the oscillator, you have the PLL, you have gain stages, filter, amplifier, that runs through a coaxial, which is attached to antenna, which once again shoots your radio waves out through space in this beautiful and well-defined relationship I mentioned before between electric and magnetic fields. Then, on the other end of it, you have a radio receiver. So the radio receiver is going to be what picks up that message or that data and decodes it so you can listen to it. So the receiver essentially works backwards from the transmitter. First you have your antenna, which is picking up the signal. And then you have a tuner. And what the tuner is doing is making sure that you are only picking up a very particular frequency. It is sorting out, separating, if you will, the sine waves. So you're only getting one of those. And it's using resonance to do so. So your tuner is what, and you can imagine very literally, like when you're tuning into a radio station, you're deciding which frequency you want to be listening to. So you have the antenna, you have the tuner, and then you have the detector or the demodulator. And like I said, you have taken an audio signal and you've encoded it. So now you need something that's going to decode that audio signal. And you're going to use a demodulator or a detector, which is usually a diode. And what the diode is doing is making sure that the signal can only go in one direction and not the other. So if you were to imagine this visually, essentially what the diode is doing is like clipping off one side of the wave. And then, so antenna, tuner, detector, amplifier, which is going to now take your decoded message and give it power so it can be shot out through your speakers and you can listen to it. So those are the two different kinds of radios, transmitters and receivers. And there's a lot, of course, there's so much other information that could be when it comes to the science of radios. Like for instance, we could talk about path loss, which that is the ratio between the power leaving the transmitter and the power collected by the receiver. Or we could also talk about the induction field, which is the energy being handed back and forth between the field and the circuit. But these are just terms that are used, and I feel like for the purpose of keeping this digestible and in layman's terms, I'm going to cap it at that. Particularly because I'm interested in telling you more about what SMC is going to be doing in the next couple months around our radio programming. So, coming up, we actually have a bunch of receiver kits that we have handed out to several individuals. And in the next week or so, we're going to have a tutorial. It's kind of a soldering 101 / how to build your radio receiver kit tutorial, which we'll have available on our YouTube channel. You can also, like I said, we've already passed out all the kits that we have, but if you're interested in watching this tutorial and trying to build the kit yourself, if you go to the link in our bio on our Instagram, which is at sound_museum_collective, we have a link to the kit that we actually bought, and you can buy your own kit. And then at the end of the month, we'll be having a Zoom Q&A in which anyone who's trying to build this kit or anyone who's just interested can join this Zoom in order to ask more questions about radio technology, soldering, and the actual logistics of building a kit. And then another cool thing that we're going to be having is we'll have a telephone pickup coil tutorial in which we'll be talking a little bit about the science of that, how they work, what they're doing. And then we'll also we have a bunch, I think 20 telephone pickup coils that we have bought that we'll be distributing for people to experiment with and play with. And then we'll be using recordings from that to create some sort of weird demo EP. And then at the very end of all this programming, we'll be releasing some sort of podcast of sorts in addition to an archive, which for the past few months we've been doing research on pirate radio stations near and around Philadelphia in addition to community radio, just gathering a lot of actual recordings from broadcasts in addition to conducting interviews and just doing research, in which we'll have archived very neatly on our website. And then we'll be holding a discussion between several individuals about the relationship between queer culture and radio, in addition to talking about what the future of radio could look like, because as we see it shifting more and more to the internet, how do we keep the airwaves alive? So, once again, I'm E with SMC, talking about radios. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to follow us on Instagram, and rock on forever and ever. Peace out.